Welcome to the grand final round of the 2017 Alfred Schneider World Schools Debate Tournament. The motion raised before the House today is that this House would hold multinational corporations liable for the actions committed by companies in their supply chain. In proposition, we have US Blue. In opposition, we have US Red. My name is Rebuttal, your chair. With me I have Warish, Emerson, Nelson, and Maya. Without any further ado, I call this House to order and invite the Prime Minister to open the case for proposition.
In the words of Martin Luther King Jr., cowardice asks us the question, what is safe? Expediency asks us the question, what is political? Vanity asks us the question, what is popular? But only conscience will ask us the question, what is right? In today's debate, we think it is principally unjust that people in China are jumping off factory roofs and people in Vietnam are killing themselves. We think that around the world, the suffering of these people should be mitigated. And at the end of this debate, whether you vote with your mind, with your heart, or with your conscience, your vote will go with the proposition. Now, we are so proud to propose today's motion saying that this House would hold multinational corporations liable for the actions committed by companies in their supply chain. What will I give you in my speech? First, I'm going to give you framework, burdens, and definitions. And then I will deliver two substantive arguments. My partner Shreyoshi will deliver the third. With that in mind, let's begin. First, we say that the proposition can win today's debate either on principle by saying that accountability is principally good, or second, showing that liability results in practical benefits. Conversely, team opposition's goal is the opposite, to prove to you that either this is not principally just, or that the practical harms outweigh the practical benefits. Our model holds multinational corporations legally liable by imposing fines or ordering them to pay damages, etc. And we believe that legal has a connotation of real liability, which will cause change in the future. With that in mind, let's begin with our first substantive argument. The principal argument saying that we must promote corporate obligation. Our first layer of analysis under this argument is the duty to society. The way that corporations work in the first place is they get money from the people who make up society. And as a result, they have an obligation to also serve in the best interests of the public good. In these terms, we believe that corporations should try to give back and benefit society as much as possible. Secondly, because corporations are inherently profit-motivated, the reason for their products is to help the people. However, if we want to help the people in the realest ways possible, we want to help ensure that we also diminish human rights abuses. We want to hold them liable to decrease the egregious means of production, like Nike or Primark in the status quo. Now, why do you prefer the world of the proposition? Because corporations have more resources, an abundance of them, and developing regions don't have adequate resources for their own populations. As a result, under the proposition model, there is more redistribution, and we help to ensure that the quality of life for all people is elevated around the world. We believe that it is principally just to ensure that every single person has a high quality of life, but you would disagree.
Wouldn't it be more beneficial to hold the supply chains accountable themselves, so we ensure that we are getting across the point that these supply chains cannot be committing these human rights abuses?
Yeah, under the proposition world, we do exactly that. We ensure that we diminish all of these human rights abuses, and we stop them, because we're holding the big company in charge liable. If these small companies are committing these terrible, egregious acts, then the big company is attacked, and the big company will prevent this from happening, disincentivizing any of these human rights abuses from happening even more. Our second layer of analysis under this argument is the corporate duty to workers. Now, we say that there is not an obligation, not only to society as a whole, but to the employees of that company. Because in a corporate structure, employees sign a contract. They are obligated to work for this corporation. But on our side, we believe that the corporation also has an obligation to the employee to provide safe working conditions and a decent quality of living. However, in the status quo, in the world today, we don't see that happening. Workers, left and right, are being abused by these corporations. They are being taken advantage of, and we think this is principally and morally unjust. We believe in a world where there are more human rights and there is more discretion, which is why we believe that the corporate duty to workers is really important in today's round. On these two principal grounds, we urge you to vote on team proposition. Our second substantive argument is to discourage abuse in corporate supply chains. Our first layer of analysis here is by forcing companies to pay attention to these abuses. Now, we think that these corporate abuses is a prevalent issue in the world today. Both a lack of regulations and a lack of liability has led to international disasters and scandals due to these horrific abuses in these factories of developing countries. For example, in 2013, the Rana Plaza collapse in Bangladesh killed 1,135 people. When those 5 factories collapsed, the big corporations in charge didn't do anything. These low worker standards prevents a safe working condition. It prevents people from actually having adequate human rights being protected. And we think this is principally unjust. But you would disagree.
We don't believe this liability is actually going to happen for the supply chains at the point to which you resolve them of responsibility by only fighting these big companies.
We don't absolve anyone of responsibility. We are increasing accountability by forcing the big companies in charge, who are paying and empowering these small supply chain corporations. We're holding them liable. That's why it's so important. These small supply chain companies wouldn't survive if the multinational corporations at the top didn't pay them with their profits every single year. If you didn't manufacture in unsafe areas, these factories would shut down and set an international precedent. We believe that these corporations who are currently perpetuating these human rights abuses need to be punished, and only under the world of the proposition does this happen. Our second example is that companies, a lot of companies in the status quo, use things like child labor to produce their own work, or slave-like labor. For example, Nike, Unilever, ASOS, and Uniqlo are only a few amongst many countries in the international community who abuse children and slaves in order to produce their work, in order to produce their goods. We think this is fundamentally unjust. But in total, the International Labor Organization quantifies in 2016 that 19 million people globally are currently working in forced labor, currently being exploited by corporate entities. Furthermore, 170 million children are victims of child labor in the status quo, and many of them are workers for these big multinational corporations. In a world where there is no liability, there is no incentive for these corporations to take action on these small supply chain corporations. But under the world of the proposition, where there is liability and accountability, we hope to ensure that these abuses will go away in the long term. Furthermore, we see that the efficacy of this in countries like the United Kingdom and in France. They implemented these legal ramifications for poor working conditions. And guess what? There's been a decrease of them across the board. Now we want to implement them on an international level. We believe that all corporations should be held accountable, not only British ones and not only French ones. Our second layer of analysis here is mitigating environmental degradation. And that's because there are lax environmental policies in many of these developing nations where these factories are located. So for example, in Canada or Germany, there are strict laws, which means that there are higher costs for business. But in countries like China or Bangladesh, there are weaker environmental laws, allowing them to exploit the environment. We think this is principally bad because of the fact that first, it decreases the environment that the people live in. But second, it's practically bad because it harms the environment for every single person. Climate change is a pretty big issue that we can all agree on. But when these companies are using these resources in an unsustainable way, we think they must be held liable and they must be punished. Our third and final layer of analysis is workers' rights. In the status quo, these rights are commonly ignored, and the formation of advocacy groups is ignored. For example, a 2015 study of Walmart's supply chain camps in India, in Cambodia, and Indonesia found that they refused to negotiate with their workers at all. Labor rights activists call Walmart, quote, notorious for being the most difficult large brand to communicate with. These powerful, big corporations, the bigger they are, the less they care about their own workers. We think this is wrong. That's why there needs to be liability. They aren't alone. This is a global problem. In fact, in 2000, 3,000 South Africans sued Cake plc, a London-based mining company, because of their negligent control and supervision, which caused thousands of people to die and thousands more to get lung cancer. We think that when there are terrible working conditions, these big corporations in charge must be held accountable. There's not one reason for you to propose, there are 170 million reasons for you to propose. The people who are suffering. That's why you vote on the proposition. Thank you.
I thank the Prime Minister and welcome the Leader of Opposition.
From the last 8 minutes of the proposition, we essentially heard a nice big analogy of how really we need to support the idea that individuals' human rights need to be supported, and that really that's the fundamental justification for why we hold large corporations accountable? Well, no one in this debate is going to argue that human rights are unimportant or that human rights should not be protected. The real thing that matters in this debate is whether or not holding the large parent corporations accountable through liability measures is the best means to accomplish the ends of getting rid of human rights violations. That's where the real heart of this debate exists, and that's where most of the clash is going to emerge on our side of the house. In this speech, I'll be doing a few things. First, I'll be going over everything that we've heard so far from Rainan's first speech, and then I'll be establishing our stance and substantive arguments for the opposition. The first substantive argument that we would have is this idea of illegitimate accountability, and the second is about the economic harms due to increased liability. But before we get into all of the substantive matter that we have for the opposition, let's start with the proposition. Now they first come up here and tell you that really they have two ways to win this debate. They say first, either they principally prove that accountability is good, or two, they prove practically that the benefits of corporate liability outweigh any potential harms. But let's look at what they tell you first. They say that if you hold the principal accountability as being beneficial in the long term, they say that they should win the debate. It's not enough for the proposition to say that accountability is needed. They have to prove why accountability on the behalf of large corporations will actually result in the tangible, practical aims that they are trying to accomplish of decreasing human rights violations. Just simply saying they have a moral obligation to hold corporations accountable doesn't mean they achieve their principal ends that they're advocating for. At that point, you only support the means that accomplish the principled ends. We contend only the opposition does that. But then they say on the practical that they have to prove that the benefits outweigh the harms. We agree that, yeah, we can go for a cost-benefit analysis. We'll prove why the harms of holding large corporations more liable only serve to undermine the principle behind human rights violations. But let's look at the first two substantive arguments that they brought to you in this debate. First, they tell you that really there's a principled obligation for holding large corporations accountable, and their second substantive argument talks about the principled reasons for decreasing abuse. They essentially are both couched in one big assumption, that the model that they propose, that you would impose fines as a penalty to hold large corporations liable, will actually be effective. However, only two scenarios can emerge. Either one, the fines won't work and corporations will bite the bullet, literally amounting to no change, or two, the fines will, according to them, prove effective, but even if you buy that fines could be an incentive for corporations, they never actually give you an explicit link as to how the fine will either A, manifest itself, B, the degree to which the fine will be imposed, or C, why the fine will be linked to directly forcing these corporations to combat the human rights violations that don't even exist under their company, but rather the companies in their supply chain.
Sir.
Hold them to that burden. Before I move on, a point.
I think there's a fundamental misconception about what our model is. We don't just advocate for fines. We see the government have the power to shut down these operations, do lawsuits, and do fines depending on the severity of the crime.
Okay, so given that now you want to advocate for state regulation of all of these corporations, this is where we perfectly segue into the opposition stance. We think that the regulations that they would have the state provide over large corporations should not be imposed whatsoever. So that begs the question, what is the world that the opposition advocates for? What is our stance? We think that we should only support regulations on the smaller supply chain companies because they're the perpetrators of the abuse that they talk about in the first place. But moreover, we tell you is that even if they try to say we can do both in their world, here's why you can't. We will prove to you why uniquely holding large corporations liable actually is uniquely leading to a lot of harms that undermine their own principle, as I will get into in the first two substantive arguments. But let's go back to really the two principled arguments that can be meshed into one that they make in their first speech. First of all, they never tell you how, really, we have to defend that really abuse isn't important. We contend that we don't, so at that point, we can all agree that abuse is important to combat. At that point, again, it becomes a means of which you can actually accomplish those ends debate. So, regulation, what we would argue, is the real problem with these supply chains, not the accountability itself. So, if you hold large corporations accountable, they're actually squirreling away from the real heart of the motion. But let's actually look into the first two substantive arguments for the opposition. The first substantive argument is about the principal illegitimacy of holding large corporations accountable. We have a few layers of analysis here. Our first layer is the principle behind the illegitimate form of accountability of holding those multinational corporations liable. So, what we would recognize on the opposition is that, well, we should not have supply chains liable, we should not have large corporations liable because they're not the ones committing the human rights abuses in the first place. The proposition says that they're targeting the root problem by, quote, having fines as an incentive and state regulation as an incentive, but they never prove links or impacts as to how those means to accomplish their ends manifest themselves. But second of all, we would say, is that states with more stringent state intervention those states with their regulations would actually be even worse for these corporations, even actually worse than human rights violations. We saw this with Venezuela and with Angola. They have typically less regulatory compliance because they have a greater level of enforcement, because that would diminish profits of corporations. So why would having these sort of corrupt institutions that do exist in large part in many countries in the global south, where a lot of human rights violations occur, we think that that actually undermines the very principle they're trying to protect. Because if corporations are liable, then the companies under the large corporation supply chain will feel like they're absolved of all blame, meaning that they will feel like they're able to continue perpetuating the very abuses that they say are so problematic. But then let's go on to our second layer of analysis, which is about the harms of regulation. We think that state intervention uniquely disincentivizes accountability in two ways. First of all, when these states come in and regulate these large corporations as they would have you impose a fine on those large multinational corporations, at the very best, it would create a case of complacency because the government would feel that just by levying a fine against a large corporation, that in and of itself is enough to combat all these abuses. But second of all, if anything, what we would argue is that holding these large corporations accountable only increases the use of loopholes. Why? Because what we both fundamentally recognize, that Reagan literally reiterates in his own speech, is that large corporations' fundamental motive is to make a profit. We've seen how corporations skirt loopholes when liability was imposed on them in the past. Look to the United Kingdom, where minimum wage laws were imposed, they were increased, and so companies actually tried to decrease employment benefits and kind of trade off any cost in that sense. Second of all, we saw that safety standards were implemented in some factories in China, and if anything, wages were cut and environmental regulations were violated. At the point where you would increase costs to corporations, which in their world would come from fines, you uniquely see their ability to try and skirt those regulations, create more loopholes, increasing the human rights abuses that they're trying to avoid. The second substantive argument for the opposition is about how there's an economic harm to increased liability, two layers. First is about the decrease in profitable risk-taking. Now what we would tell you is that companies' potential for risk is diminished because of liability. And the risk that we think comes with some risky investments is good for a few reasons. First, because in the case where risk pays off, it's good for the company. But more importantly, it's good for the consumers that would benefit from the economic growth within that company. Because when a corporation is able to profit more, that means they're able to decrease the cost of their products because they have more money to work with, helping consumers in the long run. But the second layer of analysis that we bring to you is about these harms in decreasing globalization. When you hold corporations reliable for every company in their supply chain, that literally means that if any one of those companies in the supply chain commit any sort of human rights abuse, the corporation has to be held accountable. That uniquely incentivizes the corporation to literally cut out entire companies from their supply chain just to mitigate the likelihood of being fined in their world. Meaning that at best, you create a big case of unemployment in which all of those companies in the supply chain are completely cut off from the large multinational corporation, uniquely decreasing the likelihood that they can make a living for themselves. We try to protect people, but their means preclude that from happening. That's why we oppose.
I thank the Leader of Opposition and welcome the Deputy Prime Minister. Hear, hear.
Out of the last speech, we heard little to no engagement with the actual principal arguments that we give you on our side of the house. We tell you, corporations are committing human rights abuses. We tell you that these multinational corporations have no liability whatsoever now. We tell you that people are losing their lives, they're committing suicide, and there are horrible conditions that they're working in. What do they tell you? They tell you that, oh, corporations are going to be hurt economically. We think that on a fundamental level of the debate, on the principal level, the promoting a good well-being of life will always outweigh any economic harms. Because things like death are irreversible. Things like a bad economy can be fixed. A few things in this speech. First, doing some fundamental clarifying of the round. Second, going over some key assumptions that side opposition makes in this round. And third, and finally, giving the third substantive argument on side proposition. So first, a fundamental clarification. Side opposition contends that things like liability won't actually occur. I think that they can they can allow us to feel that liability can occur, because it's the only way we can actually have this type of debate. If liability didn't occur, we would have no type of debate. This debate is supposed to be be about whether holding corporations liable is good or bad. Our fundamental stance is that holding liability allows for more accountability for corporations to help decrease these abuses. We're still waiting for some engagement on that point. Now, going on to the two key assumptions that side opposition makes in today's debate. The first assumption is that they assume that supply chains are always the ones who are carrying out these abuses. They have a fundamental misconception about how much autonomy supply chain companies really have.
Yeah.
They don't really have a lot. What we see is that actually multinational corporations are ordering these supply chain companies to carry out these human rights abuses because it's cheaper for them. It allows them to save money in terms of not keeping up with workers' human rights conditions and not paying them fair wages and not actually looking at accountability measures. We see that it's multinational corporations that can actually entice supply chain companies to engage in this behavior for a couple of key reasons. First, because supply chain companies aren't rich. They're much poorer than the multinational corporations. That means that they're dependent on these multinational corporations to actually get business. What does that mean? It means that supply chain companies are desperate to keep any type of business that they can get. So whenever a corporation hires them or contracts them, they're going to do whatever it takes to actually keep that business. And for many people, if that means committing human rights abuses for these supply chain companies to stay afloat, they're willing to make that sacrifice. We shouldn't be delegating the blame on supply chain companies for something they're fundamentally coerced to do. Give the blame to the multinational corporations that are doing the coercing. It's a pretty easily understandable argument. If multinational corporations are the ones that can actually handle the type of legal liability that we give them, then we shouldn't be punishing the underdogs who are simply the ones that lose out of this equation. Furthermore, we see that liability actually forces multinational corporations to stop ordering these human rights abuses because it threatens legal action. That first hurts companies' profits because things like fines and lawsuits are extremely expensive and corporations are going to want to maintain their profit, they're going to maximize their profit margins. We think this is a pretty intuitive argument. Second, it hurts companies' reputations because for big multinational corporations like Apple and Nike and Primark, the media latches onto any type of story associated with these corporations. So if they're getting sued for child labor in China, the media's going to know about it, the public's going to know about it, the public's going to know that the corporation's doing something that isn't morally justifiable. And third, we also see that it hurts companies' functionality because if the government because if corporations don't actually change the behavior, under our model, we see the government has the ability to shut down certain operations to coerce compliance. Now, going on to the third subject argument on side proposition about how liability actually helps businesses. First layer of analysis under this argument is that liability actually levels the playing field. We see that it levels the playing field for two important groups. It levels the playing field for small businesses, and it also levels the playing field for other multinational corporations. Why is this true? Looking at small businesses, we see that multinational corporations can actually beat out smaller competition because things like cheap labor and inhumane working conditions save money for multinational corporations that they can't do for small businesses. But I'll take your point.
We find your characterization of supply companies as being completely innocent and completely non-actively perpetuating human rights abuses extremely problematic insofar as all of the examples Raiden gives you have to deal with the supply chains, not multinational corporations.
I think we're giving you a reasonably nuanced analysis about why supply chain companies are actually going to be coerced into doing these things. We're not necessarily saying that they're innocent, but we're saying punishing supply chain companies does not achieve the policy goals of reducing human rights abuses that bigger multinational corporations would be able to do if they were held liable. Now, going on to the small businesses that we can actually level the playing field for. Two key examples here. First, we see Apple. We see that Apple actually realized that there were really high suicide rates associated with their workers. But instead of actually doing anything about it, they literally installed safety nets outside of the windows. So what we see is that multinational corporations can just influence their way out of these situations. They can turn a blind eye. Smaller businesses don't have the means to do this, and most small businesses aren't even willing to engage in these human rights abuses in the first place. Now, we see that in the prop world, small businesses and corporations won't have to engage in these inhumane abuses in order to stay competitive, because things like liability measures force multinational corporations to stay accountable. Because the fundamental problem here is that multinational corporations engage in these abuses because it's a lot cheaper for them. But if liability makes things more expensive with lawsuits and fines and the potential shutting down of company functionality, then we see that it's no longer economically profitable for them to engage in these abuses. That's why we level the playing field for small businesses that actually use moral means to engage in their business practices. But second, we see that this is also going to be leveling the playing field for other multinational corporations. We see that not all multinational corporations are going to be like Apple or a corporation like Tyson or going to be like Nike. We see that there's actually a lot of multinational corporations that use moral means to engage in their businesses. A great example of this is going to be Starbucks. We see that Starbucks actually makes an effort to engage in ethically sourced coffee and fair trade coffee, and it provides a brand to consumers that their products can actually be used from ethically sourced materials. That's why we say that it's so important to level the playing field so that these other multinational corporations don't necessarily have to lose out on competition. But I'll take your point.
So if we follow through this, we reach a point where ultimately these supply chains are like, we have no liability on us. Therefore, they start taking whatever actions they want because they know that they're not being held accountable. Then who's harmed?
I think there's a misconception about how relationships between supply chains and multinational corporations work. There's a contract that happens, right? Multinational corporations don't necessarily own supply chains, but they do have a large amount of power over them because the contract itself is skewed towards multinational corporations having the most amount of power. It's because corporations have the most amount of money. They're the ones that actually give money to supply chains. So what we see actually is that supply chains themselves aren't going to be just acting independently. There's going to be a lot of oversight from multinational corporations in a world where we actually enforce some sort of liability to make sure that corporations actually hold them accountable. But our second layer of analysis under our third set of argument is that liability actually benefits the reputation of businesses. Why is this true? It's because by encouraging fair business practices, we establish a good reputation for corporations because consumers can feel good about buying products that weren't created with abuse. Consumers are going to be more willing to buy products from businesses with good reputations, as the example of Starbucks proves. Starbucks is immensely popular because a sizable population know that their products aren't going to be abusive. So, all in all, we see that in the world of the proposition, we have a world where we are most effectively allowed to decrease the abuses that occur. We set aside opposition gives you no fundamental reason as to why our regulations wouldn't work and why their regulations wouldn't work. They don't really draw a distinction. That's why we're so proud to propose.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister and invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
This debate was never supposed to be about whether human rights abuses are bad. Rather, today's debate was very simply supposed to be about the mechanism Team Proposition proposes for combating injustice. Insofar as Nick Hill very eloquently tells you that this mechanism only worsens injustice for all of these stakeholders they claim, for people it absolves their responsibility from supply chains, and it only makes the conditions they advocate for championing worse. That is why we're so proud to propose. In this speech, I'll be doing a few things. First, I'll be going over the two substantive arguments we heard from the proposition and going over some of the attacks they made against our case before, secondly, going on to addressing the third substantive argument from the proposition, which is about harms to workers. But now let's talk about their argument. But now let's talk about the case of the proposition. First, they talk about how let's talk about their model. First, they talk about the idea of having fines for legal liability. We agree that they can develop a way to propose liability, but we can do it with a better mechanism than what they are advocating for. Their underlying assumption is that imposing fines somehow increase accountability. But first, just because big companies are fined, that in no way combats abuse or raises accountability in supply chains. They don't tell us how this happens. But secondly, this model allows big companies to simply pay a fine and continue maximizing profit, which Nick Hill tells you is it's not only possible but likely. But now let's go on to their idea that companies have an obligation to serve the people. We think it's very interesting that they bring up this idea and in the same breath tell you that companies are motivated by profit. The underlying assumption is that companies will actually act in the obligation of the people. Let's talk about the example of how states with more enforcement on multinational corporations didn't lead to an increase of accountability, but rather Nick Hill tells you that at best it created complacency and at worst it only increased loopholes, worsening the conditions they tell you they want to improve. Either way, corporations practically don't act on serving the public, and they act on profit. That only increases regulations and decreases the impacts that the proposition would have you believe happen on their side of the house. But now let's talk about their examples of French and British populations. The underlying assumption is that principally human rights abuses are bad. First off, we don't see that it's our burden to actually argue with this principle, but rather it's a debate about the mechanism of accountability through multinational corporations rather than supply chains. They conflate regulations with liability and fines on big companies. We support regulations on supply chain companies, but condemn the idea that liability on these parent corporations decrease human rights abuses. Now let's talk about why the two can't coexist, but before I go on, I'll take a point of information.
There's nothing fundamentally different about your structure of regulations versus our structure of regulations. You're just changing who they're given to.
We would say no, and I'm going to go into that analysis right now. They still absolve supply chains of liability, they decrease globalization, and they decrease risk-taking, and they harm the very people they claim to advocate for, and we'll go on to that more in our third substantive. These two ideas don't coexist insofar as they actually are in conflict with each other. But even if multinational corporations control human rights abuses, their model doesn't A, actually help to make this better, and B, let's talk about their attacks on our case. Now let's talk about first their attacks against this idea of illegitimate accountability that we brought to you. They make the assumption that supply chains are completely absolved of innocence in the status quo and aren't profit-driven. All of their substantive matter was not about the coercion of multinational corporations, but even if it was, we have three responses as to why we still win on this argument. Because first, their model isn't effective enough to actually see this liability manifest itself, but secondly, on the issue of liability, multinational corporations can cut down supply chains. They themselves characterize multinational corporations as profit-driven, and they find loopholes in the form of unemployment. People in their world are left with nothing. That's the analysis they didn't engage with that Nikhil brings to you. That is one of these stakeholders that they don't answer to us as to how it goes on. But before I go into my first substantive argument, I'll take a point of view.
Your argument is saying that slavery and child labor is better than unemployment, and then when you compare both worlds, we think this is a preposterous application to make.
We aren't saying that child labor is ever going to be okay. Rather, your mechanism only makes these situations worse for the people in question. Your mechanism is actually absolving supply chains of their responsibility, leading to more loopholes, worsening conditions. They don't actually answer any of the examples that we bring to you in our first speech, where we tell you about how after environmental regulations were imposed, it actually led to cutting down payment to certain employees and actually skirting around the regulations. We tell you about how more regulations only led to more layoffs. We think it's always going to be preferable for people to have a means of living rather than in their world where they don't have any accountability. The comparative is not being able to absolve all human rights abuses and not doing that on our side of the house, but rather the comparative is about the idea of the mechanism. Insofar as their mechanism doesn't efficiently reach any of their impacts, we think that's a solid reason to propose. But with that, let's go on to our third substantive argument, which is about harms to workers. We have a few layers of analysis here, but our first layer of analysis is worsening unemployment. Presumably, in a world where multinational corporations are held accountable for their supply chain's actions, they would be beholden to international law, face punishment for crimes they didn't commit, and will be forced to submit to the demands of the workers to appease potential backlash. Among the most common demands that multinational corporations have to deal with from are higher wages and better benefits, such as guaranteed insurance coverage and better retirement savings and plans. Unfortunately, forcing multinational corporations to dedicate a portion of their profit to such endeavors means that they will have less resources to hire more workers. We've already seen this before in the United States. For example, in 2004, when the AFL-CIO demanded that Congress pass laws that established a higher minimum wage and expand worker benefits in order to cut their costs, corporations necessarily laid off more workers. We believe this is especially true whenever we take into consideration the analysis that they themselves give you about how corporations are profit-driven. At that point, the unemployment rate in the U.S. actually rose from 4.8% to 5.6% as corporations couldn't keep up with additional costs. But furthermore, if corporations are to be held accountable for all companies in their supply chain and establish better standards for workers for all of their affiliates, then they will actually force the corporations to lay off more workers they simply can't afford to keep. Essentially, in the proposition's attempt to give workers a whole bunch of rights, they ironically are blessing workers with the biggest curse of all, unemployment. But our second layer of analysis underneath this argument is about worsening conditions for these workers. Even if you don't believe that corporations will fire more workers, at the very least, outsourcing is still going to increase. Why? That's because we recognize in the world of the opposition is that holding corporations accountable for their affiliate actions doesn't necessarily mean to more accountability that's going to be enforced. This is particularly true in the global south, where weaker governments tended to produce weaker regulations on company affiliates. Take the example example of when South Africa enacted labor reforms demanding the corporations in their country pay higher wages and improving working conditions. Numerous companies were able to skirt these regulations. Case in point, Escom is one of the most corrupt companies in the world. Government regulations did nothing to stop them from cutting wages, slashing benefits, and worsening working conditions in their own company. But furthermore, if multinational companies are forced to choose between increasing labor expenses or outsourcing labor to countries with little regulations, we believe they are always going to certainly choose the latter. This has drastic implications for workers because first, instead of protecting workers' rights, this policy would actually see workers be helplessly without a job outsourced to another country. But secondly, the outsourced job will likely be filled with more atrocious human rights abuses, undermining the very principle the proposition would like to champion. In this debate, the comparative is exceedingly clear. Their mechanism only makes all of the impacts they would like to tell you are so effective worse. Insofar as that's true, and insofar as they actually make conditions worse for the very people they would like to champion, we are proud to oppose.
I thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition and welcome the third speaker from the proposition. Thank you.
Side opposition has gotten themselves into quite a tight situation here. Because first off, they start off this debate telling you that the regulations we propose are ultimately very bad for multinational corporations. But then they stand up in their second speech and they tell you that the same regulations that we propose are going to now be applied on the supply chain, and that's going to be ultimately very good. So the object of the means are different, but the actual regulations on them is the same. Here's why this is problematic. The debate has now been transferred to whether or not we see that this is actually achievable in our world, to now what the debate of the target should be. Supply chains versus multinational corporations. We think the vote's going to be very clear that it's going to be the root cause multinational corporations. In this speech, I'm going to be doing a couple of things. First, I'm going to start off with two strategic errors before moving on to the two key questions of today's debate, which is what side does what's best for the workers and what side holds the principles true in today's debate. And then I'll give you a comparison of the worlds. Now let's move on to the two strategic flaws we've seen so far. We tell you that first off, we propose an argument on liability on how it simply won't happen, that grants us that in order to actually have a debate, we are going to see whether or not liability is good or bad. They basically tell us that multinational corporations will do nothing to be able to impose this liability. I'm sorry, but I thought we were all here when we were talking about what the basis of fiat was in the debriefing before this tournament. It's pretty clear that we have access to addressing what this is going to look like in our world. But let me tell you that if they say our regulations don't work, then they have to abide to that on their side. They can't blur the lines in today's debate and say that it doesn't work for us, but it suddenly works for them. We say that assumption that this is happening is ultimately very problematic, and this is a key reason why they've lost the debate. But the second thing that we see here that's strategically problematic is the assumption that supply chains will simply enact this type of liability that we talk about. Here's why we have a legitimate claim to this argument. We tell you first off, historically, this has never happened. They give you one example about Nike, which we'll address later on why that's not true, but we tell you that problematically, this actually is very not true. We tell you that secondly, there's no push for accountability in their world. We tell you that this is mostly because supply chains are following whatever these multinational corporations tell them to. Why? Because they're often having a smaller budget. They buy to whatever the multinational corporations do because they are a profit incentive. I mean, that's just economics 101. But let's move on to our first question in today's debate, which is which side does what's best for the workers, right? This is the face of the motion. We should be talking about how this is going to impact them. We want to make our stance explicitly clear. We support accountability in order to decrease this kind of abuse. Insofar as the means of accountability are no different from ours, we think that supply chains in the Amendment C's debate is what needs to be valued most importantly here. But then, opposition also tells you that it doesn't matter, the public is going to be keeping these accountabilities in check, and that there's a natural process of checks and balances. We tell you first off that the one example that they've selected for you is very cherry-picked. We tell you that when we look to examples like Apple, like Gap, like Primac, like Tyson, they've never done anything like this before, and they certainly won't choose to do this because they care about their profit incentive. But secondly, we see that they actually saw their earnings because of the fact that we saw with their Nike example that the reason why they saw a decrease in economic profit was not because of the fact that the public was like, whoa, Nike, chill out with the human rights abuses, but rather because of the fact that they were in the middle of a recession in the 1990s. We tell you that lastly, at the end of the day, holding liability to the MNCs tells you that this is actually starting at the root cause. They don't tell you any net harm as to why it's going to be problematic for holding the MNCs liable and how this is going to be affecting the supply chain. You simply just say that it should be that, but I'll take your point.
You absolve responsibility from the supply chains, and then you conflate the idea of regulations versus fighting a multinational corporation. The two are distinct, and this debate is about the mechanism.
All right, Emily, I think that you're just not understanding the concept of what the argument we're presenting you with here. We're telling you that ultimately what you see is that when you push these problems onto the MNC, when you hold these MNCs liable, you see that in the long term it's going to affect the supply chains. Why? Because MNCs and supply chains are linked together, meaning that when you hold one of them liable, the one that's higher power, MNCs, you're going to see that it trickles down and affects the supply chains. But then, let's talk about the crux of their case and how it's based basically upon the fact that MNCs and supply chains are going to take actions for themselves and going to be holding themselves liable, and that there's no reason for us to be doing that. We tell you first off that that's simply unlikely, seeing that it's never happened. They give you no warranty, no engagement, no link as to why this will certainly happen. We think that it's become a wash, you can't vote on this. But then they talk about consumer action, and they tell you that they try and say that this is going to be something that's very good and that it's unique to their world. That's problematic because it happens in our world too. That's why you see things like fair trade becoming so prominent of an issue. When you hold these multinational corporations liable, you see that they're going to become reports on this. They're going to be bringing more awareness to this issue, meaning that there's going to be more people who are advocating for the rights of these individuals that are working within these corrupted businesses. We tell you, well, that moves on to the second question, which is which side holds the principle true. We think the principle has been pretty clear in today's debate, that there is an obligation to ensuring the rights of workers. This debate boils down into what method is the best to achieve what's best for alleviating these abuses. We think when it comes to the point at which we are actually trying to achieve some sort of change for these workers, that's what you should be voting on. But the opposition tells you that the closest thing to their principle here is the idea of protecting our economy to be able to help these workers. Remember what we tell you. We tell you a couple of fundamental things here. First off, that the economy that they are protecting, that they are bolstering up, does nothing to protect these workers. For instance, that's why you see things like Nestle, Aldo, and Walmart profiting up their businesses while stamping upon the very lives that are creating the things that we wear, that we use on a day-to-day basis. We think that that's pretty problematic because they do nothing to incite change within that. But then secondly, we tell you that if we talk about what holds a greater importance in today's debate, we think that if you're going to be valuing whether or not we are in debt or whether you're going to be experiencing death, we think that death is ultimately going to be more impactful. Why? Because debt can be reversed, however death can't. Furthermore, this economic pressure that they talk about being so bad is actually very good because these profit-incentivized companies, when they experience such pressure, they choose to actually react. They choose to enact policies that are going to be benefiting the workers instead of finding ways to get out of it. We think that that's an actual way that you're actually able to see quite some simple change within our world. But then let's move on to this quick little quibbles about who's responsible, the supply chains versus MNCs. We think that the opposition has continuously stood up and told us that we paint supply chains as these innocent members of society. We tell you, first off, that's just not true. Supply chains are just as responsible for the human rights abuses that we see in the status quo. However, we tell you that when you're placing accountability on MNCs, that's actually a way to affect these supply chains. But Nikhil?
Okay, so let's talk about corporations. Regardless of whether or not it's a multinational corporation or a small supply chain company, both are companies and both are motivated by profit. Your argument about coercion is predicated on the assumption that the latter is not.
Nikhil, I ask you to engage with what looks like in an economic hierarchy. You see that at the top of the ladder, there's the MNCs. At the bottom, there's the supply chains. When you affect the MNCs, it's going to trickle down to the supply chains. This has been clarified multiple times in today's debate. We ask them to engage with it. But lastly, let's talk about how we see that there's no point in holding this accountability in the long term. We see that supply chains, the reason why supply chains should not be held accountable is because they are carrying out the orders that MNCs give them. They tell you that the majority of the times the people sitting up in those ivory towers telling these businesses to continue such human rights abuses are the people who are in charge of these MNCs. We think that it's pretty clear in which debate who you should be holding accountable, what ways to achieve that, and it's clear that the proposition is the only one that's actually able to enact change. The worlds are clear in today's debate. You're going to vote for the prop.
I thank the speaker for the eloquent remarks and welcome the third speaker from the opposition. Here.
we talk a lot about this idea of accountability. However, both the proposition and the opposition have gone about proposing how this accountability is going to be enacted in different ways. Now, when they come up here, they say, no, you only have to assume that these fines are going to work for the proposition. But this isn't necessarily true. We can see that we can propose a different idea of how to ultimately hold these people accountable, which we have. So what we really need to be discussing within this is we need to be discussing the idea of regulation on the supply chains, as the opposition presents, versus this liability of multinational corporations, as the proposition presents. So this is the first thing that needs to be addressed. Holding multinational corporations liable versus increasing regulation on an international scale. What would this look like for our side? What we propose is we want to ensure better working conditions among the supply chains done on an international level. We want to ensure that there's better environmental conditions that takes things like pollution, global climate change into account. Now, Nikhil told you this in his first speech. He came up here and he said, we support regulation on these shorter supply chains. And they have really yet to engage with this idea. The only response that we've really heard from them is this idea that the multinational corporations are making all of the decisions for all of the supply chains, and therefore we're never going to see any of these supply chains committing bad actions, right? Wrong. And here's why. What we're seeing in the status quo, in fact, all of the examples that Raymond brings you has to do with this idea that these supply chains are making the decisions on their own. Now, we see that this problem only increases when the supply chains know that they're not going to be held accountable. Rather, the multinational corporations are going to be accountable. Look to Enron, for example. In Enron, which inherently failed and took hundreds of thousands of people's retirement funds away, is all of these individuals who were running Enron didn't believe that their name was going to be tarnished by the actions that they were committing. They all said that this liability was going to fall on the multinational corporation. So they continued with what they wanted to do, which ultimately hurt tons of people. But what we see actually is going to happen is we're going to see this is going to happen if we only hold the multinational corporations accountable. Rather, we need to be holding these individuals, the supply chains, accountable so that they know that their actions are going to have consequences. But let's just say that we just do hold the multinational corporations accountable. This is going to possibly result in a couple of things. First, they pay the fines and nothing changes. Or two, they're scared that they can't hold all of their supply chains accountable, so they shorten their supply chain, decreasing their international business presence, and then what happens is that new companies will just fill into these areas and ultimately pay the fines. Both bad things. But three, we can see that these companies should not be held accountable for the actions taken by their supply chains because it will be more effective to just hold the supply chains accountable. They haven't engaged with this. They haven't provided any unique benefit to holding the multinational corporations accountable. Rather, they just say that we should because inherently the actions committed by the supply chains are going to change because we're holding the multinational corporations accountable. We need some sort of a link there. Why is holding the multinational corporations accountable better than holding the actors of these decisions accountable? What we need to see, or to which they respond, with this idea that supply chains don't act independently of multinational corporations. This is a fundamental misunderstanding on the side of the proposition. Now, Emily already came up here and explained this. She said that supply chains are profit motivated, which drives many of their actions. Therefore, we can see if the supply chains were to be held accountable through things like these fines, they would personally be incentivized to change. This is where we're going to see this change. We're not going to see the change on their side of the house when we are not holding the people who are actually committing these horrible human rights abuses accountable for their actions. Now, they keep bringing up this idea on their side of the house that we need to be helping the people. And I would fundamentally agree, which will lead me to my next question, who helps the people? But before I get into that, your point.
Let's say that you do end up holding supply chain companies accountable. What's to stop multinational corporations from just dropping those supply chain companies, getting a new one, and then ordering them to commit human rights abuses?
Okay, so what we're going to see here is you can hold multinational corporations accountable for the actions that they pursue, but you should really be focusing on holding the supply chains accountable for the actions that they pursue. I fundamentally believe that those are two different things. If we're just holding the multinational corporations liable for the actions that the supply chains are committing, those negative harms, you see, again, as I already have stated, that the supply chains are like, oh, we don't have any accountability on us, liability's off our shoulders, we can do whatever we want in order to make a profit, which we've previously stated. But let's talk about this idea of who helps the people. Well, multinational corporations, if we were to hold them accountable, we're going to see that this abuse is only going to worsen. Why? Well, I already explained this. Because these individual companies, the supply chains, who are looking at all of their different ways which they can make a profit, are going to see, okay, well, what we're continuing to do seems to be working, such as using these human rights abuses, so we'll just continue to do this to continue to make a profit. Or, second thing, even worse, they're like, well, now that we know that we have no accountability, we can just only further pursue these human rights abuses because we know that we are going to make a profit. So this leads me to the second question, which is probably the most important of today, which is why should we hold multinational corporations liable for supply chains actions? Well, the short answer to this question is we shouldn't. And we have a couple of different layers as to why this is. But we really need to be evaluating this on the comparison. Now, they told us one thing at the beginning of this speech. They even presented it with, we need to be doing what is right. And we would agree, we do need to be doing what is right according to our conscience, which would lead us to believe that we should be taking whatever means necessary in order to take steps to achieve the absence of these human rights abuses. And the way that we should be pursuing this is we should be pursuing this by increased regulation. But first,
those abuses that you talk about on the principal level, they're best going to be mitigated by attacking the source of those abuses in terms of the decision-making process, because MNCs are the ones that perpetuate these practices time and time again.
okay, what we see here is that the MNCs are not the ones that are perpetuating these practices. What we see here is that we can hold these people accountable, but we shouldn't be holding these people accountable for the supply chain's actions. The supply chains are acting independently in many cases of the MNCs. If the supply chains are making these decisions without the knowledge of the MNCs, then we see that the MNCs really have no principal obligation to be held accountable for what is going on here within these supply chains. But let's just say that we do follow through with this, and we hold these multinational corporations liable for their supply chain actions. We see a couple of things can happen. First, we see that it can shorten the supply chain. What we have already stated within our first speech is that these individual companies don't want to have this accountability on their shoulders. What do? They just cut off the supply chains entirely. They say, okay, we don't want this liability, we're just going to shorten this. This is going to harm the international community in a couple of ways. First, all of those supply chains inherently have jobs for all of these workers in the international community, meaning that all of these people are now unemployed. But second, it leaves a space for other companies to come in and take over these different corporations. Those people who are most likely just going to be willing to pay the fines. Second, we're going to see that it's going to be decreasing globalization. What we're seeing here is in the status quo, because of all of these different supply chains, we have partnership opportunities which allow developed nations to grow. It allows people to access jobs. It allows people to access bigger industries and international ties, which allows that developed nation to ultimately grow and gain economic benefits. We take that away when we hold these multinational corporations liable. And it's because of these reasons that I'm so proud to oppose.
That concludes our constructive round. So to begin the reply round, I welcome the opposition reply.
The opposition side was very clear as to what we stood for in today's debate round. We agreed that human rights abuses ought to be combated. We agreed that those were egregious things that supply chain companies do commit. But what we fundamentally perceive the debate in this motion to be is whether or not the means by which the proposition would tackle those problems would actually result in tangible action to mitigate them. That's where we think that the proposition failed to uphold their burden. In this speech, I'll be doing a few things. First, I'll be going over the 4 strategic areas that we heard consistently throughout all of the proposition speeches before fundamentally clarifying the single solitary reason why the opposition wins, which is everything about how we help the people. But let's talk about the 4 strategic errors that they made on their side of the house. First off, they say that we can essentially debate the mechanism by which they implement these liability measures in order to hold these corporations accountable because, I hate to use debate jargon, they would fiat it. Are you kidding me? In a world where the debate, and we consistently frame it as a means debate, that means that we have to be able to, in some way, actually debate the principle and the mechanism by which they're trying to accomplish protecting these workers. We will grant them that they can feasibly implement fines, but whether or not those fines will work is something that we have the ability to contest. They're saying we essentially cannot debate their model. We think that's reprehensible. But the second strategic error that they make is that they conflate liability with fines and regulations. Now, they say that we support the same things that they do, except on supply chains. No, they support liability and fines. We support regulations. Those are two very different things. We argue that with regulations, you avoid government complacency and ensure that the government is regulating the very perpetrators that are carrying out the abuse. But third of all, Layla comes up here and tries to give you an economics 101 lecture about how all companies, all these multinational corporations are motivated by profit. That isn't just isolated to MNCs, that also includes these smaller supply chain companies. All companies are motivated by profit. Let's make that clear. Just holding the top dogs accountable doesn't mean that these other supply chain companies aren't motivated by profit. They still are, which means that human rights abuses will still be committed. That's analysis that we've all told you that they've continually neglected. But then we tell you, fourth of all, that all offense that they have is predicated on the assumption that their model actually follows through. As I will explain in evaluating the fundamental question you need to ask yourselves when determining who wins the round, they don't prove how their model will work. So let's ask the one overarching question that firmly establishes why the opposition wins, which is who actually protects the people that both sides claim are the most important stakeholders in this round. First, the abused, and second, the workers and the unemployed. So first, let's talk about the people that are abused. At best, at their highest ground, the government essentially becomes complacent because they feel like they've done enough. This is the analysis that I tell you in the first substantive, that Emily and Piper carry through in their speeches, that when a government imposes fines and fines and liability measures onto these multinational corporations, that means the government is saying, okay, we want to take this liability measure, and after that we'll stop there. They never give you analysis as to what more the government will do to fight these abuses. And if they do think that the government is going to do more, it's too late in their reply speech to say that they will. But then we would have you believe that if anything, we would argue that regulations should be on the part of the actual countries where these supply chain companies are located, because they're the real perpetrators of the abuse. It's morally reprehensible to basically penalize the multinational corporation for not committing the abuses directly. So, when they say that the multinational corporations are coercing their supply chains into committing these abuses, that's false because those supply chain companies are also motivated by profit. But then we talk about workers and unemployed. At the end of the day, we gave you unique analysis that Layla literally does not respond to on our third substantive, because we tell you that not only are supply chains cut short because these corporations want to cut costs creating unemployment, but at the very best ground, you undermine their principle that they're trying to protect. At the end of the day, the world of the proposition is centered around this idealistic premise that by having fines, you save workers. What we tell you is that no, we look at a more nuanced approach, we actually protect them in the long run.
Thank you to the opposition reply speaker. I invite the final speaker of the debate, the proposition reply.
Team Proposition really likes accountability. So at the end of this round, I will hold accountable two groups of people. First, multinational corporations, and second, the lies of our opponents. So first, let's clear up a big misconception in today's round. Our side opposition made this a means debate. We agree with this. We've been interacting with this throughout the entire round. But their regulations are not different from ours. They also want fines. They also want government regulations. So at that point, any of their problems with our model still apply to their side. At the end of this debate, we don't see why there's a distinction. However, we think there is a unique benefit to taxing and regulating these MNCs themselves. That's why we are so proud to propose. So first, let's look towards the practical arguments of this round, because at the end of the day, they conceded on the principle already. We should stop human rights abuses. Now, our opponents concede this argument, but they propose holding supply chain companies accountable instead. Here we have 5 responses. First, these regulations have systemically failed in the past. Nikhil's speech about factories in China admits this. Companies are still violating these standards in the status quo, even if they are supply chain companies. However, MNCs being held accountable creates an economic leverage, because those are the companies that are richer than the supply chain companies. Supply chain companies are desperate for the business of these big multinational corporations. And in a world where MNCs are held accountable, supply chain companies will also fall in line. Second, we stop these abuses because, like Shreyoshi tells you, multinational corporations are the ones who order the human rights abuses and cutting costs in the status quo. And even if you don't buy that argument, at the least, They are turning a blind eye on the suffering people. This is principally and practically bad. That's why we vote on the proposition. But third, we talk about legal liability. It shuts down these bad corporations and creates public outrage, both of which are checks on these multinational corporations. That's how we prove efficacy. And fourth, even if you don't buy this argument, remember that supply chain companies also want profit. So as a result, any arguments about skirting regulations also applies to supply chain companies. At the end of this day, your arguments work against you. And finally, we tell you the unique benefit that Piper asks for. These MNCs are the root cause of these decisions. So as a result, we are hitting the head of the steak, not the body of it. We are looking at the root cause of this problem. That's why you vote on the proposition. But second, let's talk about intervention. Can it feasibly happen? The opposition argues about corrupt regimes in Angola and Venezuela. First, these are cherry-picked. Second, they are extreme of this motion. But third, there is a fiat that we could have the assumption that there is feasibility. And even beyond that, this is less likely in developing countries which have supply chain companies that they propose regulating because those governments are typically weaker. We think that it is more feasible to regulate MNCs around the world. That's why we stand on the proposition. And finally, intervention is not just fines, but paying damages, being able to be sued, and even being able to be shut down. We ran this analysis throughout an entire round, and they just don't interact with it. You can't just make up blatant lies in the reply and the third speech. You must listen to what we've been giving you the entire round throughout. Finally, let's talk about human rights. We talk about slavery and child labor, and your response is that to alleviate this, some people will be laid off. First of all, this won't happen. The minimum wage increase hasn't caused long-term unemployment. Look at the American economy now. There is still a very little unemployment, around 4.8%. But even beyond that, even if this does happen, we still contend that slavery is bad, and child labor is worse than a little more increase in unemployment. Now, when Emily talks about how this is the biggest curse on employees, we think that slavery and child labor are far worse. So for that reason, you still vote with the proposition. And finally, they talk about globalization. We argue that this trade was built on the backs of cheap, unregulated labor, and that is a decrease. If there is a decrease in globalization, that's expected, but we think the trade-off is worth it. By preserving human rights at the end of the day, Team Proposition fights for the people that we all agree in this round should no longer be abused. The proposition world gives you real change in multinational corporations and supply chain companies, but our opposition world only solves the surface level problem, because at the end of the day, we have been building on this analysis and our opponents don't interact with it. We urge you to vote on the proposition, because at the beginning of this debate, while I asked you to consider who was right, at the end of this debate, think about who was left, the people. Vote proposition.
Thank you everybody for an enjoyable debate. Everybody should wait here, the judges will step out and then we will announce the decision.
But there's going to be, so you have like 5 minutes, there's going to be some sandwiches from the lunch that you can grab if you're hungry again, or maybe after the decision is announced, before you take the shuttle, you can also have some food, and we'll be back. You can go now, you can have like
Thank you.